right, well, hi everybody, and welcome to the Wild Neighbors Speaker Series. We're really happy that you're here with us today. This series is a collaboration with Travis County Natural Resources, who co-manages the Balconies Canyonlands Preserve with us, and a number of other private and public partners also co-manage the BCP with us as well. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jaya Torres with the City of Austin's Wildland Conservation Division. Today we have Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Dr. Tania Homayoun here with us to talk about hummingbirds. After the presentation, Jeremy Hull with Travis County will manage the Q&A session. So feel free to put all your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And there's also going to be a recording of the webinar posted on Facebook and YouTube, and so that'll be available after. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to Tania.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you guys for joining us. I know I am certainly ready and looking forward to spring. So on this day when we started off the temperature below freezing, let's all be thinking forward towards spring and enjoy a little bit of discussion about hummingbirds, one of the harbingers of spring. So if I can just get a quick verification from somebody that y'all are seeing my first slide.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. All right. Well, let's jump on into it. So I am a big, giant bird person. I love birds, and I'm excited to be able to talk with you guys about hummingbirds. I think they're one of the really cool birds that we have. We're so blessed to have so many species in the state of Texas. So that said, if you really don't know a whole lot about hummingbirds, you're in the absolute right place. For those of you that are giant hummingbird fans, hopefully there'll be some kind of cool little tidbits or facts or interesting things that you might take away. But we're going to just kind of start from the basics and talk about what are some of the characteristics that make a hummingbird, some of their biology, ecology, and fun facts and cultural connections that we have with them. And then we're going to meet a few of our Central Texas local hummingbird species. So some of the birds that you might encounter out and about near where you live. And then talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can support them through creating habitat, how to attract them to your yard, different practices that can keep them safe and healthy. And then talk a little bit too about how we can participate in community science to document the hummingbirds we see around us as part of good stewardship and science. So hummingbirds are actually a type of bird that has their own family. So there are 352 species within the family Trochilidae. They're found only in the Western Hemisphere. So this is one of the things I think that's really, really cool about them. If you want to see hummingbirds, you come to the Americas to come see them. They range as far north as Alaska and as far south into South America as Chile. They're also found in a variety of habitats. So we tend to think of them in kind of lush garden settings and things like that. But actually, they can be found in very dry deserts that reach very high temperatures. They can be found in very lowland, steamy tropical rainforests, and also in icy, high elevation Andean scrub. So they really have expanded to fill a variety of different types of roles and niches. They also, for their size, are really amazing with the things that they can do. One of the things we think about with them is flight, but we don't necessarily think about the feats that they undertake when they fly, including long distance migrations. So many of these species will migrate very long distances, including crossing the Gulf of Mexico, which is pretty amazing to think about for a bird that small. And when you look at a hummingbird, one of the things you might notice is that while they look very different from a lot of other types of birds, the one that they might look slightly similar to your eyes are swifts. And they are, in fact, their closest relatives are the group of birds known as swifts. So This probably immediately says to you, I'm looking at a hummingbird. Think about things like jewelry or little, charms or things like that. And you look at this silhouette and you probably immediately recognize it as a hummingbird. So the things that are kind of cueing your brain to see this as a hummingbird are these long, narrow, pointed wings. So that is one of the things that is characteristic of their body shape. They also have a very small body size. So we don't have any giant hummingbirds. In fact, the very smallest bird on Earth is a hummingbird, and it's called the Bee Hummingbird that lives in Cuba. And it is only 2 inches long and only weighs 2 grams. So it actually weighs less than a dime. Its nest is so tiny that it's about the size of a quarter, and its eggs are only the size of coffee beans. So that's how small some of these hummingbirds can really be. They also have very short legs with tiny feet, so much so that you're not really going to see hummingbirds truly walking around. They'll use their legs, obviously, to move around and get from perch to perch, perhaps, in kind of along with flying, but they're not going to be walking any distance along the ground. That's just simply not what they're designed to do. And one of the last things that really kind of says to us, I'm looking at a hummingbird, is that bill. So it's slender, pointed, often in some species can be incredibly long, and usually has some kind of a curvature to it, often that relates to the types of flowers that it's going to be searching in its quest for nectar. So hummingbirds have an absolutely amazing biology. We kind of take this for granted because we see them buzzing around and doing their thing, but there's so much that's actually happening in that tiny little body. For example, they breathe an average of about 250 times per minute. Their heartbeat really ranges from about 250 beats per minute at rest to over 1,200 beats per minute during flight. And in spite of all that high energy that these birds are putting out, they have to compensate for that somehow. So what typically happens when a hummingbird goes to sleep, or some of these hummingbirds that live in places where the temperature drops pretty significantly, is that they actually enter a state of semi-hibernation called torpor. So their typical body temperature is about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And when they go into a state of torpor, their body temperature just plummets and all of their functions slow down to allow them to conserve that energy. Just as a point of reference, I was kind of curious to think, what does that actually mean to a human if your body drops down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and actually that would be stage 4 hypothermia for us. So very kind of critical state, but these little birds do this as a regular practice in order to conserve energy. So one of the things that sometimes happens is people will go outside on a cold or cool morning, and there are actually photos of this documented in different places, including on the nature site iNaturalist, where people have taken photos of hummingbirds. Some of them are asleep like this, upright, but there's at least one photo that I ran across recently where it was a hummingbird hanging upside down from a perch, asleep, in a state of complete torpor. So sometimes you see them in some pretty interesting situations when they do this. So some other things that we often associate with hummingbirds, that they have this beautiful iridescent plumage, especially around their head and their throat. And that bright iridescent patch that's found on many males' throats has a special name. It's called a gorget. And that's the name for that iridescent patch of feathers. And typically when we're talking about hummingbirds, the males are generally more brightly colored in their plumage than females are. So that's one way to kind of get a handle on whether you might be looking at an adult male or an immature male or a female. And so sometimes those immature males look a lot like females, and it's kind of hard to tell them apart. But the thing that we really think of as being super cool about hummingbirds is their capacity for flight. And I'm getting a warning here about my Let's see if I can turn off my video. So I'm still here, but we're going to keep going with this here on the GIF, and hopefully this will continue to go smoother for us here. But actually, hummingbirds have a unique way that they move their wings. They actually create a figure-8 pattern with how their wings go. So they have an upstroke and a downstroke like other birds, but most birds in flight, the power to fly is actually generated from that downstroke. But the way that a hummingbird's wings work is they're creating lift on both the upstroke and the downstroke. And so this allows them to do some really, really cool things like hovering, flying backwards, and sometimes even flying briefly upside down. And so seeing that just a little bit slower, it's absolutely amazing what they're capable of. Their wings are actually, in many cases, beating about 70 times per second when they're undertaking a direct flight from point A to point B. But they also, when they're doing particular kind of high speed movements, like going into a dive, their wings can actually beat over 200 times per second. They can go as fast as 30 miles an hour, again, when they're going in direct flight from point A to point B. And one of the things they do with this amazing capacity for flight is they engage in some really elaborate courtship displays. So that's something that's pretty cool. And when you look at this tiny little body, and again, think about what it's doing here in flight, they are capable of migrating up to 20 hours straight when they're flying across the Gulf of Mexico. And that is absolutely amazing. And one of the ways that they do this is that going into migration, they can sometimes put up to 30% of their own body weight on in fat. And that fat is the energy that they use in order to power those long distance flights. So when you see hummingbirds congregating, especially in fall, around your flowers, around your feeders, and sometimes they start to look kind of a little round. They're starting to kind of go from burb to borb. They're the cutest at that stage, but it's kind of sobering to think that fat deposit that they're putting on that makes them look so little round bodied is what allows them to survive when they do that flight across the Gulf. So that said, what do hummingbirds eat? They actually will eat not just nectar from plants, but actually they're looking also for protein from invertebrate sources. And one of the things that I think people commonly think is that hummingbird bills, like, how do they work? So maybe they're like kind of a straw and they suck up nectar, and actually that's not how it works at all. As we've gotten better technology to be able to study how hummingbird drinking nectar works, we've gotten to be able to see up close how their tongue is actually shaped. And so it's not like a straw at all. It's actually very long with grooves in it and a forked tip. And so they're actually pulling nectar into their bill with this pump action and curling the sides of this groove over to kind of pump that nectar into their mouth where they can swallow it. So using this process, if you think of it as kind of a single lick when they kind of do this pump action, about 15 licks in less than 1 second is all it takes for them to be able to drain the nectar from a single flower. And so all of that energy that they're getting from the nectar from plants is really important because it helps power that flight that they're going to be using to pursue their invertebrate prey. And so I say invertebrates and not just insects, because while they will hunt for small insects, one of the things that they also really like to eat are small spiders as well. So moving on to feathers and color. So I mentioned this term iridescence that we often associate with hummingbird feathers. And one of the cool facts about it is that when we talk about the color on hummingbird feathers, it's not actually truly, in many cases, due to a pigment. That those iridescent feathers are actually the result of what's called structural color. So what we now know about how this works is that there are actually tiny bubbles on the feather's surface that as the light hits them, the light refracts and bends in different ways. And so depending on the angle that bounces back to us, we may see kind of a dull color like that, or we may see something that's a brilliant, shiny, iridescent red. And that's where that comes from, is structural color. So the other thing that hummingbirds do with their feathers that I think is really remarkable is that they're in some cases capable of creating sound with their feathers, which is pretty wild to think about. But this all kind of ties back into these elaborate courtship displays that some of these birds will do. And in fact, many of them are these dives where they can reach really, really high speeds. And all of this is in the service of trying to impress a female. So the males are the ones who do these courtship displays. And you may actually see this. You may see some strange looking little shape that seems to be kind of going back and forth, like almost like a pendulum in a U shape or a J shape. And that, if you see that, is probably a male who's showing off for a female that you may not see, who's probably perched somewhere taking very careful, elaborate notes about what she thinks of this display. And in fact, some of these flight patterns are unique, and you can actually distinguish the species by the pattern of the courtship flight. But what's really cool is some of these males will actually bend their tail feathers towards the female to kind of amplify the sound. But as the wind passes through the tail feathers, it actually can create a trill or a buzz, which is part of the display. Now, that said, that's pretty cool and all, but some females need something a little bit extra, as in the case of the Costas hummingbird, where the male puts on what is affectionately known as a full-on purple squid face. And lest you think I'm making that up, this is a male Costas hummingbird. These guys are found in Southern California, Southern Nevada, Western Arizona, and Baja California. And usually these feathers lay flat against the male's body, but when he's doing a display flight for this female, he'll fan those little feathers of his head and gorget out, and it literally looks like a little purple octopus is perched on his head. But apparently this is what she wants to see in order to assess whether he's a suitable mate. So if all goes well, and we have a successful pairing, typically mating occurs, and then the male is more or less out of the picture. So it's the female who builds the nest, incubates the eggs, and tends the young. Typically, hummingbirds' eggs are roughly about the size of peas, and their size of their nest is pretty small to start with. So generally about the size of a walnut shell, which is kind of sobering when you think about the fact that there may be multiple eggs in this nest and multiple babies. But what's really cool about hummingbird nests is the way that the female constructs them, they're actually able to stretch to accommodate the growing youngsters. So some other kind of cool facts about hummingbirds, in addition to their biology, they have an amazingly intimate and cool connection with a variety of different cultures throughout the Americas. In the Aztec religion, the hummingbird is associated with Huitzilopochtli, who is the god of war and the sun. And so you can tell when we start talking a little bit more about hummingbird behavior when it comes to foraging, that clearly the Aztecs were watching really closely and admiring the behavior of these fierce little birds. They actually had a belief that fallen warriors would return as hummingbirds, which I think is really amazing and beautiful. They're also present in many North American, Native American stories and traditions, and usually associated with stories that relate to them giving assistance to people, providing healing and good luck. We also have some of our own kind of pop culture, old wives' tale type things that circulate around about hummingbirds, such as the story that hummingbirds don't actually migrate themselves, but they actually ride on the backs of geese. And this is false. We got to give those hummingbirds credit for the amazing flights that they undertake. So getting a little bit closer to home, out of those over 200 species of hummingbirds, we have 18 that can be seen in various parts of the state of Texas. Although if you were looking to collect a good list of hummingbirds, your best bet would be to go out to West Texas in order to do that. It's not uncommon to occasionally get some visitor species that come in from further west or from the south. But broadly speaking, these are the species that you might expect to encounter if you are out and about in different parts of the state. So getting a little even closer to home, when we're talking about Central Texas, we really have a handful of hummingbirds that you might expect to encounter regularly. So one of those is the ruby-throated hummingbird. So generally speaking, these birds are bright green on the top of their head, their back and their wings. They have white underparts, and you can tell the male, who's on the bottom picture here, from the female, because if the light catches his gorget, it basically shines iridescent red. They are the only hummingbird found commonly throughout most of the eastern United States and Canada. And so this holds if you go into the eastern part of the state of Texas as well. And what's kind of cool about them is they have the largest breeding range of all of our North American hummingbirds. So here in Central Texas, though, we are also within the range of the black-chinned hummingbird. They look very, very similar to the ruby-throated hummingbird. So they're green on the top of the head, their back and their wings, and they have those same white underparts, but the males will look different. So where in a ruby-throated hummingbird, you might see what looks like the bottom picture until he turns his head in the sun and suddenly you see a bright flash of red. But in a black-chinned hummingbird, most of those feathers don't actually have any iridescence to them. They are, in fact, have mostly a black throat, and what you'll be looking for is a little necklace of purple along the gorget that sometimes catches the light. So if you repeatedly see a male that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of color going on down there, that's one sign that you might be looking at a black-chinned hummingbird. Another thing that's interesting note about these guys is while most hummingbirds will cue into colors like red especially, these guys are often going to be drawn to the colors of recently blooming nectar sources as well. So it's not for them strictly about the red flowers. They're also looking for things that they know are pretty reliable nectar sources. So this, of course, raises the question, okay, well, how do I know if I have a ruby-throated or a black-chinned hummingbird? And the answer is it's very tough, especially if you're new to this and just trying to figure it out. The males are obviously going to be a lot easier to tell apart than the females and the immature males. But probably the easiest way to start doing this, this telling apart process is to look for birds that are actually sitting down perched. So they will often sit down, and when they're foraging on a feeder, they're not always flying. But what you're going to try and look for is to compare the length of the tip of the tail with the length of the tip of the wings. So ruby-throated hummingbirds, generally their tail is going to extend a little bit longer than the tips of their wings. So that's what we're looking at here in this picture. And in black-chinned hummingbirds, the wingtips are often about as long as that tail and sometimes just a little bit longer. So another thing that sometimes people look at is when the birds are in flight and hovering in front of a flower or in front of a feeder is whether or not or how often they pump their tail. So generally speaking, people tend to associate more tail pumping with black-chinned hummingbirds and less tail pumping with ruby-throated. But it does take some practice and some time, so it gives you something to work towards as you are watching the birds that are visiting the areas near you. So the other hummingbird that you're likely to encounter, maybe a little less frequently than those two in Central Texas, is the Rufus Hummingbird. So these guys are a little bit smaller than those two species. What they lack in size, they make up for in fierceness and energy. They are typically brightly colored in the sense of being kind of having a little bit more orange on them. So again, when you look at these guys, their wingtips are going to be not as long as the tip of their tail. And what you're going to see is a little bit of a wash of orange in addition to that dull green on the female. So you can see her up on the top there, and you see on the side, she's got a little bit of that kind of orange showing. And the males look very different. They've got this kind of bright orange down their back and on their sides, and they're going to have this iridescent red showing up on their gorget. What's a really cool fact about these guys is they have one of the longest migrations of any bird based on body size. So considering how small they are, the fact that they're able to undertake migrations that take some of them as far north as southern Alaska is pretty amazing. So keep your eyes out, though, for a handful of other species that may show up as well. So these 6 birds are ones that have been recorded in Central Texas, so keep an eye out. They're not going to show up as commonly, but it's a real treat when they do. So you may also potentially see Anna's hummingbirds, broad-tailed hummingbirds, calliope hummingbirds, Allen's hummingbirds, buff-bellied hummingbirds, or possibly broad-billed hummingbirds. So those are some of the birds that we might see, but how can you provide some attractive space to bring them close to your yard? So like so many of the rest of us, birds need just a kind of few simple basic things. They need food, water, shelter and space, and safety. So with respect to food, again, we talk about hummingbirds and we often think about these long red tubular flowers, but the fact of the matter is that they actually will forage on a really wide variety of flower colors and shapes. So if you're looking for a place to start, getting some of those long tubular red shaped flowers into your garden is a great way to start, but don't feel constrained to that. There are a bunch of other different kinds of nectar bearing flowers that hummingbirds rely on in their native habitats, and they will come and visit them. So they are also, they are pollinators. In the process of visiting these flowers, they're actually in many cases picking up a good load of pollen on sometimes their head, but certainly on their bill and moving it around. So this is another kind of cool thing when we talk about hummingbirds. They're actually part of that amazing class of organisms that make plant life on this planet possible by being pollinators. Another common myth that we have about food and feeding is that leaving up a hummingbird feeder is going to mean that your birds are going to stay and they won't migrate. And that's actually generally not true. Hummingbird migration behavior is governed not by food, but by the changing in day length. And so if a bird is going to undertake migration, you having a feeder up is not going to make it stay. It will leave when it's ready to. Some birds decide not to leave, and they do in fact stay. So just a thing to note, go ahead and feel free if you have a feeder after your plants have stopped blooming and you're trying to get some of those last birds a little bit of extra energy on their journey south, feel free to leave it up until we get into the cold season. And once you stop seeing birds visit, then just know it's probably time to go ahead and pack up your hummingbird feeder until the following spring. So when we talk about plants, native plants are the absolute gold standard to be putting out on the landscape for food and shelter, not just for hummingbirds, but for other birds and certainly for other types of pollinators. So some of the plants that are very attractive to hummingbirds, again, have long tubular flowers, but don't discount some of those ray-petaled flowers as well. So as a general class, looking at native sages in the genus Salvia, a lot of those are really fantastic for hummingbirds and for a variety of other pollinators as well. Penstemons have that same type of shape and are also attractive. We often think about things that are plants that grow well in the sun, but if you have a shady garden, then you're able to take advantage of Turk's cap, which is also very attractive to hummingbirds and grows really well in the shade. So some other types of plants that you may consider, Flamacanthus is a great plant for them. Lantana and types of coneflowers are also really attractive as well, even though they don't necessarily have that type of shape that we think of as a traditional hummingbird flower. And as you can see there in the picture for the lantana, the benefit of some of these other plants is that they also will attract a variety of other types of pollinators as well. So another thing to think about is not just the shape of the flower or the color of the flower, but when it's blooming. So a good rule of thumb is to be thinking about types of plants that bloom throughout the bloom season. So get a couple of types of plants that start in the spring, get some species that peak in their bloom during the summer, and then some that start or continue to bloom into the fall as well. And they don't all have to be low growing. There are some types of vines like cross vine or trumpet vine that are really good. And then there are also some things that are kind of more desert type, like red yuccas, and some that actually are low growing trees or shrubs. So such as for desert willow or cenizo are actually also good options as well. So some of you might be thinking, well, I just don't have a yard. I don't know if this is for me. And you're in the same boat that I am. I also do not have a yard, but container gardens can be absolutely fantastic for attracting hummingbirds. You don't need a whole lot of space. If you have a place where you can place a pot that you can water, that you can give some light, then you have some options for getting plants out that will attract hummingbirds. So even a small stoop can provide hummingbird habitat. When it comes to feeders, this is one of the things that we get a lot of questions about. So it's not so much about the red food coloring that people have traditionally thought was the thing that they needed to do. Actually, please do not use any type of food coloring in the nectar that goes out for hummingbirds. You can do the same with attracting them by putting some kind of red coloring on the feeder itself. So many commercially available feeders actually have a red lid or little red flower ports. But if you have something that's a little bit more of an artistic design of feeder, you can simply tie a red ribbon around part of it in order to create that red that might have the hummingbird catch its attention and come over and check out your feeder. With nectar, we want to keep it very simple. So sometimes we often think that something that is organic might perhaps be better. And when it comes to the sugar that we make nectar with, that's actually tends to be the opposite for hummingbirds. You actually want to go out and get the plain white granulated table sugar. So please do not use brown sugar, do not use turbinado, stay away from organic sugars. If it's not pure white, it might, if it's got a little bit of kind of a yellowish tinge to it or a bit of a brownish tinge, it may actually have too much iron in it, which is not really good for them. So simple is better. And all you need to do is mix 1 part of the white table sugar with 4 parts of water. It does help sometimes to warm that water up. Stir it really well until all that sugar goes into solution. And then whatever you don't put into your feeder immediately, you can just refrigerate for several days and it should stay good. So one of the things that I've kind of noticed as a bit of a pro tip is that flying saucer style feeders tend to be a lot easier to clean. Like we see in the picture here, the whole lid comes right off and you can just take it over to the sink and scrub it out really well. Make sure there's no bits of mold or particulate in there. If you get bugs or something in there, very easy to clean out. And this is helpful because often your birds will be watching. They will see you come out, take the feeder away, disappear with it, and see you come out with the feeder full of fresh nectar. And they learn very quickly. I've even had a situation where I had hummingbirds come and attract my attention when feeders were empty and they could see me through a window. And it was kind of an entertaining situation, but they had me trained. And so if they would come let me know when the feeders were empty. But one thing that's important to note, as the days heat up, it's very important to check on that nectar and keep those feeders and the nectar clean. So you may be talking about taking down your feeders to take them inside and wash them every single day in the heat of summer. So that said, water can be very attractive to even birds as small as a hummingbird. They're not going to be looking for anything really deep. Again, shallow basins or drips or bubblers can be very attractive for them. And again, these are water sources, so it's important to keep them clean and free of debris and also keep them from accumulating mosquitoes. So when it comes to shelter and space, most of these hummingbirds are going to be looking to build nests in trees, even though many of them may also take advantage of things like hanging baskets or even build onto garden decor like wind chimes. They also use trees and shrubs as perches to scan and defend for nectar patches from other hummingbirds. And so I keep mentioning that they're very fierce. They are highly territorial and will aggressively defend choice foraging patches from other birds. So it's not uncommon to see a hummingbird find a perch where it can watch over a garden or a feeder, and you'll see that little head constantly going back and forth and back and forth. And if another bird comes in, they're going to try and chase it off before it can take a drink, which is sometimes successful, but very often not. You may think you have 1 or 2 birds visiting an area, but you may in reality have several times more than that, because so many birds will come sneak in. So another thing that we should be thinking about are ways that we can keep hummingbirds safe. So think about what these guys do in the landscape. They are drinking nectar from plants and they're eating invertebrates. So when it comes to pesticides, minimizing the use of pesticides in our gardens is going to be really important. So if you do have issues that you need to address, using some kind of integrated pest management techniques rather than relying on hardcore chemical pesticides is not only beneficial for hummingbirds, but it benefits all types of pollinators as well. So another issue that birds deal with, including hummingbirds, is collision with glass and issues related to light pollution. So there are some things that we can do to address this. If you have a problem window where you're having window strikes, you can use what's called the 2x4 handprint rule to basically put some kind of a marker on the window that reduces the reflectivity of the glass and makes the glass visible to the bird so it knows there's a barrier there. So when we're talking about hummingbirds though, you may need to bring that down to 2x2. And so essentially what we're doing is creating something that signals to the bird that it can't pass through that area. So when you're talking about 2x2, whatever pattern you put on your window, you want to have no more than 2 inches between a vertical pattern and 2 inches between the horizontal pattern. And so this is often a problem people run into where they buy a couple of window decals and put them on and they still keep having collisions. And that's because birds are very agile. They will try to fly through small spaces. So you've got to make that pattern very tight. But that said, it doesn't have to be something that's very big. There are a lot of really great solutions out there that are very low visibility to people, but give enough signal to birds to let them know there's a problem. So when it comes to light pollution, there's a lot that we can do around our homes and businesses to reduce this. We're at a place where we're starting to replace a lot of our light fixtures, and we want to go with things that are considered to be dark skies compliant. So generally you want to look for light fixtures that are shielded, that direct light downwards and don't have a whole lot of, that don't contribute to a lot of light pollution and sky glow. And probably one of the big things that anybody who has a cat can do that is really important for not just bird conservation, but for all of our wildlife is to keep cats indoors. What we know from research that's been done on birds in the United States is that cats, feral and free roaming cats, are the #1 human-related cause of death to birds in the United States. The other benefit that we have to keeping cats indoors and giving them a nice, entertaining environment there is that it keeps them safe as well. One of the biggest causes of mortality to cats that roam outdoors is unfortunately being hit by vehicles. So hummingbirds have a whole lot of different conservation challenges. Over 50 species of hummingbirds are considered to be of conservation concern, and our little Rufus hummingbird itself, one of our Central Texas birds, is actually considered to be near threatened. Probably the 2 biggest challenges that they face are habitat loss and climate change. And so the challenge that specifically we're talking about with climate change, besides the way that it alters whole landscapes and habitats is that hummingbirds are very dependent on bloom times of different plants. So they're getting their cues to migrate based on day length, but that's not what's necessarily driving the times that plants are blooming. And so if there's a disconnect there, it becomes very difficult for them to get the energy that they need in order to survive migration. So what are some ways that we can document hummingbirds as part of stewardship and science? The cool thing is there are a variety of different projects. Some of them are year-round and ongoing, like eBird and iNaturalist, and some of them are season-specific projects or that relate to particular stages in life, like nesting or watching feeders over the winter. So for many of you, a good place to start would be eBird or iNaturalist, and these are two different types of biodiversity databases. eBird deals only with bird data. iNaturalist will take information on any type of life. So not just the birds that you might put in, but you might also be interested in documenting the types of plants that they're foraging on. So one thing to know about eBird is it's really kind of best to use it when you're feeling ready to identify birds on your own, or if you have someone who can help you with those IDs. And what's really cool about iNaturalist is if you can get a picture, or in some cases, a sound file, if they're making a call, if you can upload that, then the user community can help you with identification. So it's a really great way to start learning your birds. And then you can move on to eBird and do full checklists when you feel more comfortable. And what's really neat about eBird is all of this data gets rolled up into making these really cool models that are used for science and conservation. So all of this here that you're seeing is the result of people just like you who have contributed observations to eBird. And scientists are able to roll this up to create range-wide maps, and the data are actually used in conservation planning. So one thing that we can do here in Texas, if you're interested in getting started with projects in iNaturalist regarding birds, we have a Birds of Texas project. So you can go to tpwd.texas.gov/trackers and click on the projects tab. That will take you to a page that has links to each of our iNaturalist projects, and feel free to join if you're interested in contributing. We also have 2 BioBlitzes that happen every year that if you want to share your hummingbird observations, these would be good places. We have the City Nature Challenge that's coming up in April, 4 days, the end of April into early May on iNaturalist, and another iNaturalist project that runs in the fall called the Texas Pollinator BioBlitz. And of course, because hummingbirds are pollinators, data on them is absolutely encouraged and welcome in this project as well. So before I pop up my information and stop sharing my screen, I do want to share some resources that you guys might be interested in about hummingbirds. There's actually a book that is published by our state ornithologist about the hummingbirds of Texas. It's available from Texas A&M Press, and some online resources that are super helpful, free to use. Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a site called All About Birds. It's an online field guide with tons of resources and information about these and many more species. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center actually has pollinator-specific plant lists. So this is a great place to get started if you're interested in adding more plants to your yard that benefit hummingbirds and other pollinators. And if you're concerned about ways to keep birds safe, such as reducing glass collision, ideas for keeping cats indoors, reducing pesticides, then I would strongly suggest you check out American Bird Conservancy's conservation program page. And again, additional resource specifically for birds about native plants is Audubon's Plants for Birds page, which allows you to search for native plant lists and vendors by zip code. And so that said, I am actually one of 2 Texas Nature Trackers biologists. Both myself and my teammate, Craig Hensley, work across the state. So please feel free to reach out to either one of us if you have questions about any of the wildlife that you happen to be seeing around you. That said, that's all I had. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have any questions.
All right, thanks so much for that great presentation, Tania. I'm going to put some links in the chat with the Balconies Canyonlands Preserve story, an events calendar, an interactive map. I'm going to put those links in the chat for y'all right now. And then we'll go ahead and hand it over to Jeremy for question and answers.
Awesome. We do have several questions in the Q&A. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a ton, and I really appreciate you spending the time to join us today. First question was, can hummingbirds be attracted to second floor balconies?
Aha, I can actually speak to this. The place that I lived in before I live in my current condo, I lived on a second floor apartment, and yes, I put out a hummingbird feeder and had some flowering plants, and yes, we had a regular visitor. So the answer to that can confirm, yes, they will go up to second floor balconies.
Awesome. Where to, and this is a tough one, but where to observe hummingbirds in Travis County? Do you have any good hot spots?
Oh, I don't know. There may be some really cool places around the BCP that could be good candidates. So I think this would be a great opportunity for y'all to be able to share some of the places where people might be able to go out for looking for birds. The one thing I will say though, no matter where you are, if you're looking for places to find a particular bird or types of birds, really great resource is to go to ebird.org and look for species range maps. And that will allow you to see hotspots and points where other people have recorded those birds at different times of the year. I use it all the time in my job when I go out birding on my own. And it's a great way for you guys to know what other people have been seeing around you in different places.
That's exactly what I was going to recommend as well, was folks going to eBird and see where everybody's seeing it. I would say also the Wildflower Center is a great spot to go because they have so many plants. They have lots of everything to see, pollinators and birds as well. So the next question is, when you were talking about migration, they said, how fast do the hummingbirds fly when they're crossing the Gulf? Do they maintain that 30 miles per hour the whole time?
That's a great question. And the honest answer to that is I am really not sure. I imagine that if they get fortunate and they get a good tailwind helping them along, so a lot of birds will try and stage their migrations, especially something that long, with weather that's kind of suitable. So if you're a little hummingbird and there's a storm coming up over the Gulf and you haven't started your flight, maybe it's best to wait until that storm passes rather than trying to get out over open water and risking getting exhausted and not making it. So if they catch a good tailwind though, that can help push them, they may be able to go a little even faster and save some energy that way and gain some speed. So the short answer is, I don't know if we've managed to document just how fast they can actually make some of these passages in favorable weather conditions.
Okay, awesome. Then we had this question repeatedly several times. We had people asking when is the best time to put up feeders? And then somebody also commented with, can you please tell people to keep them up all winter in Central Texas? Because we have overwintering Rufus hummingbirds, for instance. But can you comment on when to put them up?
Sure. So I have not yet put up mine because right now all my plants are dormant. So there's really nothing else to support them on the landscape here at this point in terms of the mass of birds moving through. So from my perspective, I don't have any overwintering birds that I've ever noted in my area. So in my immediate kind of neighborhood. So I'm waiting until we start getting some of those first blooms out in the next month or two. And at that point, I'm going to be paying attention to see if the resources look like they're right. That's when I'm going to put up my feeders to supplement. So some of it is going to vary from year to year. Some of it may depend on when you start to see birds. And with respect to keeping feeders up through the winter, I think my biggest thing in terms of encouraging people to do that would be, please feel free to do it if you are willing to put in the time and effort to take care of that feeder. Because I think if a feeder is not maintained well, it becomes a liability rather than something that actually helps birds. So that would be my only caveat with that, because absolutely, we are starting to see a lot more birds that are overwintering. And as more and more people are providing the resources for them on the landscape, many of them are deciding that they are going to stay. But it's absolutely crucial that people take very good care of that feeder hygiene and keep them clean and keep them appropriately stocked, even during, if they choose to have them out during winter.
All right. Sticking to feeders and things, we had several people say that they've heard it's recommended to boil the water or boil the mixture before using it or refrigerating. Is that true? And then also several comments about you should refill them after it rains every single time. Is that the case?
I think it's going to depend on what your feeder setup is and where you are, and what your water supply is like. So for me personally, I don't make large batches. And so I don't leave my nectar out for very long before I clean it, even if it looks like it's clean. I'm still trying to get it cleaned out pretty readily. So I don't generally bring my water to a full rolling boil. I'll usually microwave like a 2-cup measure to the point where it's starting to get nice and steamy hot, because I'm also kind of, like, I want to get this made. So let's get this process rolling and get this sugar mixed in here. So personally, I have not found it necessary to bring it to a boil, but because what I found is even when you boil when you boil the water to put in, you're still going to be running up against microorganisms and mold and whatnot growing in that nectar when you put it out. So I'd say that doesn't change the need to change that stuff very, very frequently and keep a close eye on your feeder.
Excellent. Let's see. Okay, a couple of questions about the hummingbirds who visit my feeders are very territorial. One hummingbird seems to keep all the others away, or there's only 2 to 4 visitors. Anything to encourage more birds at once to visit your feeders?
So that's an interesting thing. If your bird is not banded, you can tell the different genders and maybe different age groups are visiting, but it's really hard to say for certain who's actually there. So what I've heard is that we underestimate the number of hummingbirds that often come to our gardens and feeders, because we can tell certain types of characteristics apart, but is that the same male? Is that the same female? Sometimes we can tell, like especially immature males where they have a particular pattern of feathers on their gorget, but other times it can be really tricky. So one thing that you might want to try is figuring out what the lines of sight on your feeders are. And if you're talking about putting out multiple feeders, trying to get them spaced in your yard such that it's hard for one bird to watch over both of them at the same time, because that then gives an opening to other birds to be able to perhaps sneak around and visit rather than immediately attracting the attention of the big boss who's going to come in and chase them off. So you may have to do some kind of engineering, visual engineering on how you put out resources for these guys.
Awesome. Next is, this one may be tough as well, since this is a species that we deal with often, but the species that traveled all the way to southern Alaska to breed, why did they go that far? What's offered there in that location that they're traveling for?
That's the $1 million question for so many birds that migrate. So some of it comes down to resource competition, and when birds migrate, they're often able to take advantage of more abundant resources and less competition from other types of birds. So again, knowing that we're talking about a group of birds that's very fierce in their defense of nectar resources and space, then being able to kind of take advantage of different resources across these two continents can be a really valuable strategy. So that is kind of, to a human, I think it's a pretty inadequate answer, but they are, being able to take advantage of that peak bloom season during the summer in Alaska that many other birds just simply they're not migrating up there to do that. So.
Excellent. Let's see, next up. Is there anything that can be done for a hummingbird that has an infection? It says, I don't remember the name, but it causes their tongue to stick out and to stay.
That's a tough one, because generally by the time a bird is showing symptoms of any kind of infection or injury, it's often pretty well advanced. And certainly with hummingbirds, they are, again, just by the type of bird that they are, they tend to be very fragile. So if you do happen to find a bird that is incapacitated in some way, it could be because of something like that, where it's in very weakened condition. You're actually able to pick it up and transport it to a rehabilitator. It could be because it's been stunned by a window collision and it just simply doesn't reorient within a short period of time, and you need to get it somewhere safe. But just know that if you do find a bird that you are able to safely kind of isolate, you cannot take care of that bird yourself. It must be taken to a licensed rehabilitator who can evaluate it and decide what the best course of care for that animal is going to be. And actually, you can find a list of rehabilitators by county on Texas Parks and Wildlife's website.
Awesome. Okay. What is the lifespan of a hummingbird?
That varies, and it's an area of ongoing research, because the way that we can assess that is by banding birds and telling, again, when we get a bird and we band it, we collect information to the best of our ability based on the plumage and molt pattern that it has, where we can try and assign it an age if we're lucky enough to get a bird that's within the first year or so of its life based on some of those characteristics. Then we have kind of a starting point. And then the question goes, if a bird is recaptured, then we can look at the band number and say, oh, this is a bird that was banded this many years ago, and when it was banded, it was roughly this many years old. So it's going to vary by year, and a good place, if you're curious about individual hummingbird species, they're not going to be super, super long-lived birds, not like an albatross or not like a parrot, to kind of give you a sense there. But they can live for several years. We would get information about that from banding. And if you're curious to see if there's information about that, that would be something to look for in Cornell Lab of Ornithology's All About Birds. They often have that information in their species account as kind of a cool fact. The longest lived known bird of this species was X number of years old.
Awesome. Okay, we have about 2 minutes left, so I think we're going to get to one more question here, and there's still a lot. We're sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions. There was also a lot of chatter in the chat about types of feeders and locations and going to Rockport and everything, so everybody check out the chat before you leave. There's lots of great info in there. The last question I think we're going to get to is, have you noticed, was there a massive die-off after our various huge winter freeze that we had last year? They said their feeder visits have been pretty low this year.
Right. So in short, because of the timing of when that event happened last year, we did not get a lot of documented information about hummingbird mortality, primarily because most of our birds were not back yet. There were some reports from people who had birds that had stuck around over the winter. And generally speaking, the consensus seems to be that those birds disappeared after the winter storm. So whether they managed to leave and go somewhere else to find safety and warmth and resources, or whether they died, we simply don't know. But again, because so many of our hummingbirds are not here during the winter months, they were, as far as we know, spared the worst of the brunt of that winter storm. And we're generally seeing kind of localized areas where birds have not yet really started coming back in numbers, depending on the species. I know I can say that about eastern phoebes right around where I live. We used to have a ton, and they really haven't moved back in here yet. They kind of disappeared after the winter storm.
Okay, well, that brings us right up to the 1 o'clock hour, so we're going to call it there. But Tania, thank you so much for joining us and for having, joining the Wild Neighbors. It was a great presentation. Everybody in chat was just popping off that they loved it, and it was just fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Well, thanks y'all for having me, and keep an eye out for your hummingbirds when they start coming back this spring.
Great. Have a great day.